Hello, lovelies. Today we're finishing off our Dolmenwood triple feature review by looking at the monster book and the various other sundries that came with the Kickstarter. The monster book is 130 pages of monsters with encounter tables. It's hardback, it has a nice little ribbon, which we like. It has page references in the tables, which is nice and saves a little bit of flipping back and forth. And it also has indices of the creatures, not only alphabetically in the table of contents, but also by level and by type in the back, which is all very useful for monsters. Monsters are defined in a fairly typical old school sort of way. So you have your header, a very brief description, then you get into your stats with your size, type, intelligence, alignment, game stats including level equivalent, armor class, hit points, saves, attacks, speed, morale, and experience points. This neither has the efficiency of true old school stuff, where a stat block's like 3 lines, nor does it have the fully expansive, integrated, cover most of the bases sort of style that 3rd edition had. So it falls somewhere between the two. Personally, found it a little bit dissatisfying. Your mileage may vary. We have information on the kinds of encounters that you might run into, the sorts of behavior that they have, the speech patterns that they might exhibit, what they sound like, so that you can roleplay them a little bit, not dissimilar to NPC descriptions. Any possessions they might have on them, some of them come with particular treasures, and a treasure hoard that they might have back at their base camp or lair or whatever else. Then any additional notes on aspects of them, and then you get these flavor tables, and if appropriate you get randomized names for the creatures. None of these tables are really big enough to make them truly random beyond a couple of sessions, but in a pinch they can save your ass by providing a little bit of GM inspiration there. Like the hex descriptions in the campaign guide, there's often quite a lot of white space and a fairly loose open layout, which is readable but comes at the cost of additional information that you might be able to get with these. I tend to prefer more prosaic monsters. I used to love the ecology of features, and generally speaking, I prefer to regard dungeons as a biome rather than the whole mythic dungeon archetype. In this setting, it's a bit more forgiving, given the sort of fairy tale nature of the whole thing and the dreamlike nature of some of it. Still, the entries, while they look flavorful, are beneath the surface actually a little bit dry, I find. Not really that much more than a strapline and stats when you come down to it. I would almost sacrifice these random tables and use the space to give more information about each monster. There is additional information on some of the monsters in the campaign book related to particular hexes that they call home, but that's not true of all the monsters, so we have to kind of take it in the round, I think. There is a lot of good shit in here though, as well as slightly different takes on various monsters that you might otherwise think yourself to be familiar with, so it's worth reading carefully. If you see something that you think you've seen before elsewhere, it's best not to make assumptions and to read the description of the creature. Given my praise for the art in the other books in the series, the bestiary is, to my mind, relatively lacking. Many of the pieces suffer from the overworked muddiness and lack of contrast that so much modern game art suffers from. Some of the more naive style art, like the basilisk that we went past, has its charms, but too much loses that illustrative appeal of the Lubbock style cut paper illustration that makes the other books so visually appealing. It's much less present in the bestiary than it is elsewhere. Once we get to the appendices, you get some good shit again. We have stats for rival adventurers, adventuring parties, commoners, animals, giant animals. Though the animals, which are typically mundane animals in most books, fantasy bestiaries and so on, the animals aren't necessarily as mundane as you might otherwise expect. Some of them are rather peculiar. Then we get some folklore and rumours about various monsters that you can seed into the world. And most importantly, hallelujah, some guidelines for creating monsters that are fairly fully featured and easily transferable to other OSR, OSE adjacent games that may well be lacking much in the way of monster guidelines. You could even use them to generate cohesive creatures for Lamentations if you so wanted. Standout creatures for me include boggins, which are what you get when you order an aboleth from Temu, cobbins, which are little intelligent anthropomorphic animals, glomes, which are sort of zombified murders of crows who form into a single being, dress dapper and collect things, horrible things, scrabies, who are sort of shadowy elven traders, but evil elves, fairy tale elves, and I like their take on witches, which we have here. Style wise, to give it a low 4. It doesn't meet the high standard of the other books, but it's passable and still has a few standout pieces. It's still a step in the right direction, but not as big of a step. Substance wise, I give it a high 3. The appendices and the organisation of it save it. Basically, I didn't find the monster descriptions super expansive or helpful or useful necessarily. You have to do quite a bit of legwork to make them more rounded than just a sack of hit points to kill, which is unfortunate given the characterful nature of the rest of the books. Of the books, a bestiary is probably the most portable between systems, but this is the one that has the least that is special about it. So that's 7 out of 10, 3.5 out of 5, still above average, essentially if you're going to be playing Dolmenwood, and still a good buy for OSR people, just it's only essential for Dolmenwood. The monster creation rules are very neat, very nice, and eminently portable. Okay, so then we have the maps book, which it's a nice thing, but it is in no way essential, and it's not like you can open it up and take the maps out and hand them to the players. So I was kind of meh about the maps book. So yeah, it's completely not essential. It shows various aspects on various different maps of the woods, which is a repeat of the same map with different labels. Each time all of this information is contained elsewhere, so you don't really need it. It might be handy as a reference when creating adventures, but that's really about it. It's when you get to the settlement maps that things change. So we're back to the sort of Scandi / Slavic / Russian sort of illustration style again, which I really like. This could be almost a background painting from the original Moomins animations. But as a map, is this kind of thing particularly useful? So it's done in the style of a lot of old medieval and earlier maps and later maps up until about the 17th century, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, where it's done in this kind of semi 3D style. But this doesn't tell us a great deal about what's actually here. Right? It is a map, but it is not labelled. And so it goes for the other settlement maps. So it might be showing you the general layout of the place and giving you a feel for the character of the place, but in terms of practical use, even as a map, it's just not really there. So I question the utility quite severely, because even those medieval maps had labels on them, at least. So map book, yeah, I'd skip that. But the cloth map is quite nice. Much more useful, quite hard wearing and thick. This is not a threadbare thing. Yeah, much more useful. Can be used to soak up any spilled soda easily enough. Could even be used as a shower curtain, I suppose. Not quite big enough. So yeah, the cloth. If you're going to get a map, don't get a maps book. Not maps book. Don't get the maps book. Get the cloth map. It's much better. The dice bag is quite nice. Hard. Feels almost like canvas, I think, and it's embroidered with mushrooms and spirally patterns, which was very nice. The dice themselves are not really anything to write home about. Perhaps slightly more fitting to Jim Raji's recent card-based mold and fungus adventures, but yeah, they're okay. They're just not anything special. But you can get mushroom, forest and autumn themed dice of all kinds from Etsy and from cheap online retailers. So if you want thematic dice, maybe get the bag if they offer it separately and fill it up with those. Those would be far more effectively on brand, I think, though slightly less readable, but that's the sacrifice you make for having the pretty clickety-clacks. The pledge also came with 4 adventures, which are largely useless to me. Winter's Daughter for levels 1 to 3. The Fungus that came to Blakeswell for levels 2 to 5. Imelda's Song. Fungus came to Blakeswell from 2 to 3. Imelda's Song 2 to 4. And the Ruined Abbey of St. Cloud for levels 4 to 6. Add the pipes on Drummond Knoll from the campaign book, the starter adventure, and you have yourselves a sort of mini campaign there set in the Dolmenwood, especially once you add on random encounters and other places on the map as they explore and travel. The adventure books all use the paper cut style for the covers, which as a 70s baby I still appreciate. Personally, you know me, I don't care much for pre-made adventures, but they can always be raided for places, information, additional creatures, NPCs, that sort of thing. So they're useful on that score, I suppose. Pipes on Drummond Knoll from the campaign book. That's a simple raid on a ruin and a good way to ease new players into the weirdness of Dolmenwood via a familiar, more normal sort of play style. Winter's Daughter in some ways reminded me of the Hobsdell adventure in Dragon Warriors, but it is really a simple dungeon raid with a complicated backstory that you may or may not get involved in, but which provides a structure to the whole thing. The fungus that came to Blackswell is more of a horror scenario that would not be at all out of place in a game of Morkborg or Lamentations of the Flame Princess. So it leans away from the whimsy some and has themes of both religious intolerance and body horror. So more up my alley, that one. Imelda's song immerses you in the culture and intrigues of the Bregel, the goat people. Could do with leaning into the goatness a bit more, I think. And so it departs from the relative combative simplicity of the other adventures into courtly intrigue and the tug and pull and push of power between different factions. The Ruined Abbey is perhaps the closest thing to a more conventional medium-scale dungeon bash, but the backdrop to it is the possible reclamation of the Abbey by the church, or even potentially rededication as a holy site to some other power in the forest, which would annoy the church a great deal. That would make a decent climax to this little arc, this campaign of disjointed adventures, which is how things all used to go. So Dolmenwood then, in the round, all things considered, all the books, all the content, all the rest of it, is it worth it? Yeah, I'd say it is. It's different enough and interesting enough to a lot of the other OSR old school material out there, and I think that is the most important thing in that space at the moment, is doing something different rather than just releasing new rule sets, which this does, but it's OSE adjacent, so kind of, but not really. New ways of doing the same thing over and over again is not necessarily helpful, but settings, I think I'm coming around a little bit to Mark Reinhagen's view that what really matters these days is interesting settings. As a dark fairy tale, Dolmenwood is something that new players might be able to get their heads around, and it's definitely not either generic fantasy nor the pseudo-fantasy pap that Wizards tends to put out. Yeah, everyone's had fairy stories read to them, seen interpretations of them in film and television, knows the stories, knows the kind of rules of fairy tales, and so that gives them a hook and a familiarity with some aspects of Dolmenwood that gives them a window into the game beyond generic, dwarves and elves and whatever else. So yeah, I mean, the setting is good and is transportable between different systems relatively easily, even beyond the old school cloud. If I could be asked to put the work in, I would convert it to Dragon Warriors and do some adventures in the Dolmenwood based around Dragon Warriors. I think I mentioned before, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay would work okay. Morkborg. It may even support some other things, like Fantasy Age, with its slightly dark heritage from Dragon Age, might work. There's plenty of other slightly darker RPGs, though not full on dark, that would work fine with this, and you could almost just run using Lamentations of the Flame Princess and dial up the horror a bit more. But yeah, this was worth it, I think, in the round. There you go. That took 3 days because there was so much material and I wanted to do it all justice. I have some upcoming reviews for shorter things, but I also have some upcoming reviews for Invisible Sun's Black Cube, the reissue of which finally turned up at my door, and that is going to take a long time, I can tell. So we might have another week dedicated to a single game coming up in the not too distant future. Zang.
The Atomic Age, With its A-bombs, transistorized radios, jet engines, and a new breed of dangerous supervillain, requires heroes to face the challenge. That's where you come in. The world needs you, Agent. Agent of Swing.